What are the pillars of Islam? What is the Shahada, and what are its components? How can the Salat be performed? What is a Rak'ah, Ghusl, Wudu, Tahara, and Idhan? What is Zakat, Saum, and Hajj? What are some of the personal and social features of each? By the 10th century, the role of the hadiths and the hadith collections was moving increasingly to the center of Islamic life and practice. In previous times, random ahadith circled orally around the Ummah, adding additional information and interpretation to the Quran and Islamic practice. But as the ahadith were gathered, edited, sorted, and graded for their reliability, people could turn to a more or less standard body of literature when the question arose, what is a Muslim to do in this situation? There were and are minor variants in the different collections of hadith. For instance, Shiites use different collections of hadiths than non-Shiites. But the overwhelming majority of the hadiths found in all the different collections were more or less the same. Similarly, within each collection, hadith collectors like Malik and al-Bukhari would keep multiple versions of the same hadith if the hadith was relayed through more than one isnad, the chain of transmission. So there might be a dozen or more versions of the same hadith found in the same book, if the author of that hadith collection heard the hadith from many different unrelated sources. Eventually, these variations in the ahadith, and how these ahadith lined up with what the Quran had to say, would develop into the Islamic schools of jurisprudence, which we'll discuss next time. Now, though, we're going to focus on those traditions which are overwhelmingly accounted for in all the hadith collections, and the Quran too. What does every possible reading of the Quran and the ahadith agree on? Those activities that the Quran repeatedly and clearly commands the listener to perform, and that are also repeatedly and directly laid out by hundreds of ahadith, would, in the Middle Ages, be referred to by most Muslims as the Arkan al-Islam, the pillars of Islam. Whether Shiite or not, whichever hadith collections you were reading, you would come up with these activities, 5 in number. They are described in dozens of Quranic passages and ahadith beyond reckoning. They are, safe to say, the most easily agreed upon aspects of the Sunnah of Muhammad. Indeed, in the famous hadith of Gabriel, when Muhammad is asked what Islam actually is, it is these 5 acts that he says sums up the whole of submission to God. Each of the 5 pillars are actions that one must be able to carry out, if one is able to. The first pillar marks the start of one's acceptance of Islam. It's the activity that makes an individual a Muslim at all. One must orally, purposefully, and without coercion accept the singular reality of God and the prophethood of Muhammad. This is the Shahada, the testimony, or the bearing of witness. Simply put, the Shahada is just 2 sentences. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's messenger, although there are some minor regional variations in the exact words. By saying these lines out loud, in Arabic, with usually 2 witnesses, who are themselves Muslims, then the speaker becomes a Muslim as well. This is the very simple rite of initiation by which someone enters Islam. Strictly speaking, The Shahada only needs to be performed once in order to be a Muslim. But in reality, Muslims all over the world say the Shahada or formulas composed of the Shahada's words all the time. It's part of the daily calls to prayer, which are standard aspects in the Muslim majority parts of the world. And in turn, Muslims say the Shahada as part of those prayers. Muslims say the Shahada, or part of it, as an expression of joy, or surprise, or exacerbation. It's said into the ears of newborn children by their parents and grandparents, and it's said into the ears of loved ones on their deathbeds. Notice, by the way, that the Shahada is an act, not a belief. While you are testifying to two beliefs when the Shahada is recited, it's the recitation of the words that marks the occasion. Case in point, as the vast majority of people who enter Islam do not understand Arabic, and yet they embrace their new Muslim identity by saying something in Arabic, it seems that your understanding isn't what matters at first, but rather your will. This is also why there's some stipulations for people who want to become Muslims but live in unusual situations. Say they lack the ability to speak, or they live somewhere where there's no other Muslims around to witness their conversion. There have been, for instance, examples in recent years of people saying the Shahada with witnesses who are on the other side of a phone call, or by posting the words of the Shahada on the internet, so that other Muslims far away can bear witness to their words. While the Shahada is how one becomes a Muslim, the most basic activity in Islamic practice is most certainly the Salat, the daily prayer. It is the Quran's most commanded action. Pray. Offer glory to God. And the ahadith describing God's love of human prayers are multitudinous. The word Salat, on just the ground level, means to pray or to offer blessings. For instance, the Quran says that God performs the Salat along with the angels. It is He who performs the Salat over you and His angels, that He may bring you forth from the darkness into the light. This obviously doesn't mean that God is begging of things from us, like we typically mean in English when you say someone prays for something. Instead, it confers a notion of offering a blessing on someone or something. So when one says the Salat, it isn't so much that they're begging God for love, wealth, children, or good grades, but that they're offering blessings and thanksgiving upon God. The Salat is an act of worship. And the Quran says that the entirety of created creatures perform the Salat, each offering praise to God in their own various ways. Have you not seen that everyone in the heavens and the earth glorifies God, and the birds spreading their wings? Each one knows its Salat. In the case of humans, the Salat refers to a particular ritual of prayer, and not just any old prayer. This exact ritual is never explained in the Quran, but its practice is almost identical across the world today. There are minor regional variations, or variations of one's preference, but these are extremely minor to say the least, and could easily go unnoticed. But if you were to observe the Salat anywhere on earth, this is what you would most definitely see. The Salat is performed 5 times a day, although if one was so inclined, they can practice it more than that. The first of the 5 times starts just after sunset, as in the ancient Middle Eastern custom of dating the beginning of days with sunset, rather than the arbitrary hour of midnight. So, after the sun is set, that is when a new day is beginning, one can offer the first Salat of the day. This is the Salat al-Maghrib, the sunset prayer. Then there is the Salat al-Asha, the evening prayer, which is performed after the sky has gone completely dark. Then there is the Salat al-Fajr, the morning prayer, which is offered in the time between the lightening of the day and the sun's actual rising. Then there is the fourth Salat, the Salat al-Dhuhr, the noon prayer, which is performed at solar noon, the time of the day when the sun reaches its apex, which actually falls after 12 p.m. And then finally is the Salat al-Asr, the afternoon prayer, which can be said any time between the sun's apex and the beginning of its setting. But again, there are minor regional variations in how these times of the day are calculated. Each prayer contains a number of rak'ah, cycles, the order of specific movements and words that one says in the salat. A rak'ah goes like this. The one saying the salat stands upright. Then they bow at their waists. After a few seconds, they stand upright again, and then immediately they place their knees, hands, and foreheads on the ground. They remain in this position of prostration for a few seconds, and then they come up for a second or two into a sitting position, then prostrate themselves for a second time. This is the end of the first rak'ah, the first cycle, and then the person rises to their feet again, and the second cycle may begin, which is identical to the first. After the second rak'ah, rather than standing, the Muslim sits upright and recites particular Quranic formulas in Arabic. They bless the other people that they are with, and they offer praise to the Prophet Muhammad and recite the Shahada. If this is the morning prayer, the prayer is now completed with a greeting of peace to the person at one's right and then one's left. Or, if one's praying alone, the same peace offering is offered once to the right and then once to the left, but that same peace offering is now being offered to unseen angels which are said to be present. The other prayers have more rak'ah, more cycles than the two of the morning prayer. The evening prayer has 3, then the sunset, noon, and afternoon prayers have 4 of these cycles. During the 2, 3, or 4 standing parts of the prayer, Muslims recite the Fatiha, which is the first surah of the Quran, consisting of just 7 short verses. In the first 2 cycles, they also recite some other chapters or verses from the Quran as well. In any mosque or any location where Islam is particularly popular, the times of the 5 prayers are marked by the idhan, the call to the salat. In Arabic, the following formula is said, although again with some minor regional variations. First 4 times, someone calls out, Allahu Akbar, God is greater, or God is most great. Then the following sentences are said 2 times each. I bear witness that there is no God but God. I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Hurry to the salat. Hurry to salvation. God is greater. And then finally, it is declared that there is no God but God, only once. Some of the more noteworthy variants of the adhan can include lines like, I bear witness that Ali is God's friend, which is said after testifying that Muhammad is God's messenger, which of course is common in Shiite settings. Also, the morning adhan is usually accompanied by the line, As-salatu khairun minna naum. Literally, the prayer, the salat, is better than sleep. After the line, hurry to salvation, and it's sort of the Muslim version of, get up, sleepyhead. The person who recites the adhan, the muezzin, is typically selected for having a strong, lovely voice. In a rather traditional setting, where there are many mosques located not far from each other, one hears a whole chorus of these voices going off at slightly different moments of the day and with slightly different rhythms, creating an echoing symphony of voices calling the Muslims to the salat. Less striking is the modern replacement of the muezzin with the recording, which is played over a speaker of some kind. However the Muslim is called to prayer, though, the non-stop daily rhythm of the salats functions as something like a religious clock, setting a beat to the day with 5 regular interruptions built in, We can only imagine how the Salat would have felt to Muslims before the time of clocks, when the Salat was the way that you would mark the moments of your day. The prayers literally defined time itself. Although you say the Salat throughout the day and every day, before any one Salat begins, the Muslim ought to enter the state of Tahara, ritual purity. Tahara is the condition of the body and the clothing being clean and ready to address God. Basically, Tahara means to be free from any dirt or bodily fluid that is not where it's supposed to be. There are several kinds of ways that Muslims may enter the state of Tahara, but ideally they involve the use of water to wash away unwanted contaminants. If one has just come into contact with the typical contaminants of daily life, one can perform the wudu, a minor washing or a minor ablution. The wudu involves rinsing or wiping the following with water, in this order: the hands, the mouth, the nostrils, the right and left forearms, the face, the head, the ears, and then the right and left feet. This could be done quite quickly and following waking up, using the restroom, passing gas, or just all the normal things that make you dirty in your day-to-day life. For some less common contaminants, one must perform the major washing, or the major ablution, the ghusl. This is washing the entire body, making sure that water touches everything from head to toe. The ghusl is how one enters Tahara after contacting semen, menstrual fluids, giving birth, or coming into contact with a corpse. There's also a third way to enter the state of Tahara, the ritual purity needed in order to perform the Salat, and that's called the tayammum. If someone's in a situation when water is not available, or clean water isn't available, the Muslim can purify themselves by scrubbing or stroking the skin with another clean substance, such as fine sand or smooth stones. Tayammum isn't as common as it once was, but you can imagine Muslims in the pre-modern world who were traveling or living through a drought, but still wanted to be able to say their Salat. Part of the state of Tahara, ritual purity, also involves one's clothing and surroundings. Clothes must be free from fecal matter, urine, semen, blood, or any other bodily fluid, save sweat. Again, with modern technologies like washing machines, this isn't as bad as it used to be. But try to imagine a pre-modern farmer or shepherd, or someone who works with animals all day, needing to keep themselves clean from feces or urine on their clothes. Likewise, the environment in which one prays must also be clean. This is relatively easy in a home or in a formal place of prayer like a mosque or a shrine, although it does require removing one's shoes in all those settings. If you're somewhere where it might not be clean, or it's definitely not clean, you can also make use of the sajjada, a prayer rug. Usually it's just a very small carpet, but sometimes it's a piece of cloth. The sajjada is, strictly speaking, just a barrier between the ground and one's bare feet. And, like clothing, the sajjada must be kept clean of contaminating substances as needed. Interestingly, no living school of Islamic practice has a strict notion of material corruption. That is, there's no such thing as something that is impure by its very nature. Blood, semen, urine, feces, menstrual fluids, dirt, and corpses are all naturally occurring substances. They aren't innately dirty, but rather, they're corruptive when they're out of place. So the blood in your veins is tahara, but having blood on your skin is not, and so it needs to be cleaned off. And this is why nature is also, by definition, pure. A Muslim can say their prayers outdoors, for even though nature is full of substances that contaminate people, outdoors in nature is where those substances are supposed to be. And so, the natural world is just as clean as the most tidy mosque, and therefore most fit for the Salat. Although the day's 5 salats are preferable for everyone, they alone are only required of those who have reached puberty, and what exactly counts as reaching puberty varies. Although often, children will mimic their family members' salats out of piety or just silliness. One must also be in good health, so for instance, a very sick person would not be required to stand up and bow down, and so you must be physically able to perform the salat. And then there's also variations based on this. So for instance, a Muslim who uses a wheelchair will say the entire salat from a seated position, or if they're bedridden, while lying down. It's also preferable to perform the salat with other people in a congregation, 2 or more Muslims praying in concert. The most typical congregations are just families or roommates, any Muslims who live together and therefore will pray together. But there are also larger congregations that are held in various public settings, such as mosques, shrines, courtyards, lobbies, or outdoors. Most Muslim scholars today would say that it's required for men to say the noontime prayer on Friday in a public congregation, generally a local mosque, whereas women are not obliged to do the same. For Shiites, though, no one is required to say the prayer in a congregation, regardless of gender or time, although saying a prayer in congregation for Shiites is still preferable. The other 3 pillars are those that occur a little less often. While the Shahada, in theory, only needs to happen once, and the Salat happens throughout the day every day, the final 3 pillars are a bit more periodic. The 3rd pillar is the Zakat, almsgiving, giving to those in need. Literally, the word Zakat means purity, so it's sort of like saying material wealth, which is a cause for many sinful thoughts and deeds, is purified by giving it to someone else who needs it more than you do. The Quran says there are 8 kinds of people who require this zakat: those who have a certain need, the poor, the collectors of zakat themselves, those who have a spiritual problem, people in captivity, people in debt, people who are fighting for the ummah, like in an army, and people who are traveling, which before modern transportation was much more dangerous and difficult. How exactly the zakat works is different from place to place, time to time, and Muslim to Muslim. It depends on which hadith you read, how you interpret it, and how money and wealth works in your particular historical context. But usually, the zakat is between 2.5 and 10% of one's yearly profit, not just a total of what you own. So, if you're losing money because you are poor or in debt, or you just break even this year, then you aren't required to make the zakat. You can, and that would be considered meritorious, but it isn't required of you. And again, how and when the zakat is paid varies. Especially in the pre-modern world, you could just give to people on the streets or people that you may know who need it. No one but God would ever know that you did it. But you could also give zakat to a mosque, who would distribute needed money or food or other goods to people as they require. Or you could give to a charity like an orphanage or a hospital, or, in some less common and more modern cases, to a government who collects zakat like any other tax. The 4th pillar is sawm, fasting, meaning abstaining from food, water, sexual activity, smoking, and a few other activities during daylight hours in the month of Ramadan. From sunrise to sunset, the Muslim is to eat nothing, drink nothing, and try to keep their minds and actions directed towards God and the other people around them, especially people in need. Often people will try to watch their personal ethical behaviors during Sawm too. So, for instance, they'll try to avoid swearing, lying, or speaking ill of other people. While those are never good things to do, during the Sawm, they may constitute breaking the fast, based on one's opinion of what counts as fasting and not. Like with the other pillars, stipulations are made for those where the fast would be unnecessarily difficult or even impossible. Children who have not yet reached the age of puberty don't have to fast, even though some will try to, even just for a day or in a kind of playful solidarity with the rest of their family members. Likewise, people who are sick, traveling, menstruating, pregnant, or held up by an emergency situation are not required to do the Saum during the same time as everyone else. But usually, they'll try to make it up by fasting at some other time when it's more doable. Just some quick notes on Ramadan, the 9th month of the Islamic calendar. Most people in the world today use the Western Gregorian calendar, which is based on the movements of the sun across the 4 seasons, adding up to 365.25 days a year. Like many calendars, the Islamic calendar doesn't work this way. The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, so the months and years are calculated by the phases of the moon. The lunar calendar has 355 days, and each of the months is either 29 or 30 days long. Months begin and end when a new crescent moon is sighted, which is significantly easier to calculate than a solar calendar is, which requires quite a bit of math and knowledge of astronomy. So, when the 8th crescent moon of a lunar year is sighted, the month of Ramadan begins the next day, and so too does the fasting. Now, unlike a solar calendar, a lunar year's months will move through the seasons. So Ramadan and any other month can fall during any season. And because there is a different amount of daylight at different seasons and in different places on the Earth's surface, the number of hours a given Muslim might have to be fasting can vary incredibly. While near the equator, the length of the days only vary a little through the course of the year. In the extreme north and south, during the summertime, the sun can be up for 20 hours or more of the day. Likewise, in the same locations during the wintertime, the sun might only be up for a few hours. So while any Muslim who fasts will fast for 30 days in a row, the number of actual hours of fasting can be quite a bit different from Muslim to Muslim. Ramadan is also not just about fasting. Lots of little social norms may shift to accommodate the Saum. For instance, a Muslim might get up much earlier than usual to eat a large breakfast before the fast begins in order to fuel their body for the day. In places with higher Muslim populations, stores will close during daylight hours and will be open instead at night, restaurants most especially. People will generally nap more, as a fast can lower your energy level, and of course, napping is a great way to pass time if you don't want to be eating and drinking. And likewise, many Muslims will visit the mosque more often, read Quran more often, pray more often, and reach out to friends and relatives in a spirit of community and celebration. Strictly speaking, most traditional Muslim scholars would argue that the fast isn't supposed to be a hardship. It's a trial for sure, but it shouldn't cause undue suffering either. In fact, Ramadan is, for most Muslims, the best time of the year. Holiday lights will be strung up, and the fast-breaking feasts, iftars, will be held when the sun sets. People will gather with loved ones or even strangers with food and drink waiting in front of them. But they can't eat it just yet. Then, when the sun finally goes down, the merriment begins. It starts simply with a sip of water, or commonly a few dates, but often elaborate meals follow the fast breaking, complete with seasonal foods and special treats. In a majority Muslim city, the quiet, pious days of Ramadan very quickly shift to loud, happy nights full of errands, friends, eating, and shopping. The final pillar of Islam is the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca and the performance of particular rituals while there. While a Muslim can, of course, go to Mecca at any time, the Hajj only happens once a year, during the last lunar month, Dhul Hijjah, literally the one with the Hajj. Although all the pillars of Islam have some flexibility because of one's given circumstances, the Hajj is the only one of the 5 that many Muslims will never perform. And likewise, it's only required of those who are able to do it realistically. Remember that before modern transport, traveling to the Hijaz was done on foot or if you were lucky, on top of an animal. If you were coming from West Africa, or Spain, or China, traveling all the way to Arabia could take years and would cost a small fortune. And so, in order to go on the Hajj, you would have to be free of debt, you would have to leave your house in order, your children's education would have to be arranged and paid for, elderly relatives provided for, and wills written up. Indeed, many Muslims would make the Hajj with no plans to ever come home again. They would simply intend to die and be buried in Mecca. These days, however, the Hajj can be planned like any other vacation. If you can get a passport and a plane ticket, you can go and be back to work next week. The Hajj is also the only pillar of Islam that the average Muslim would probably not know how to perform on their own. There are many different events, rites, and locations in and around Mecca that one must attend and perform. And, of course, in the early days especially, there was always the problem of people getting lost on the way to Arabia. So, Islamic governments throughout history, including the modern Saudi Arabian government today, have arranged for pilgrim guides to walk the pious through the Hajj. Where to go, when, what to say, where to sleep, and what to do. What are the pillars of Islam? What is the Shahada, and what are its components? How is the Salat to be performed? What is a Rak'ah, Ghusl, Wudu, Tahara, and Idhan? What is Zakat, Saum, and Hajj? And what are some of the personal and social features of each?